And we're live. We got a new show. A Palestinian and Israeli React. That's exciting. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. Today we're going to do Fauda, and let us know what you wanted to see next. I actually think someone brought up we might do Janine next. And what makes this show special is this. I did not think of this show. It actually has nothing to do with me. It's a community project, and that's really what we're all about. The Great Debate is a community project where people come together and all contribute content. So those who came up with this are the ones starring in it, and they've already become pretty well known. They're starting to become a fan favorites. Without further ado, let's bring them on. Dani Iftach and Zahir. I'm gonna leave you both. But if anybody's new to this channel, subscribe, like, tell your friends about it, and support us on Patreon if you really like what we do. Oh yeah, we do have some visionary members who need a shout out. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd. That's a green energy company in Australia. We have SOB Cannabis. That's a cannabis company in California. And Max Marine are 3 Patreon visionary members. And a big shout out to all our other patrons who help us make this content. If you do want to support us, you can see a link in the description. And that's it. Dani is here. I'm gonna leave you to it. Enjoy.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. For those who haven't seen any of our videos before, I'm a Palestinian from the West Bank. I grew up there, and we will be talking about Fauda today. Dani, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm Dani. I'm Israeli, and what we are trying to do here is just, kind of react to pop culture. So like we said, this week is Fauda. Hopefully next video might be Janine. And really just see it through the lens of each of their respective nationalities. So Zahir through Palestinian lens, and me through Israeli lens. And I really hope you guys enjoy.
There's sort of a lot of things about the show that we can comment on that are sort of tangential to at least what I noticed watching it. It was a very, very difficult watch for me. It took me
I love the show. I binged my life out.
I could barely get through. Yeah, I could kind of get through like an episode a day. It really got to me. But there's all sorts of like funny stuff in the show, and inaccuracies that are sort of there in like every television show. So I don't want to fixate on that sort of stuff too much, although we might mention along the way just because some of it's quite funny. Things like the accents in different places. The Hebronite boxer who doesn't have the most distinct Palestinian accent, like the Hebronite accent, or the undercover agents claiming to be from particular places and then speaking completely differently, or like funny things like every character having Abu, or like having it on their ID and stuff, which I thought was hilarious. But that's sort of there in every TV show, and ultimately, like, we understand that it's a thriller, that it's meant to be entertaining. It's designed to get views and keep an audience engaged and stuff. So it's not so much about that. Like, I understand the monetary and the dramatic incentives for the filmmakers to make the show the way it is, or even sort of not care about stuff that's not really going to matter to the audience. A bigger picture and more along the lines of the different things that I'd like to talk about is what it says about the narrative, and how, I mean, watching Fauda, I felt like.
Do you want to? I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but do you want to give a synopsis to our viewers, just what it's about in a nutshell?
Yeah, so Fauda sort of depicts these undercover operatives in different scenes in each of the seasons, and it was sort of widely portrayed as being like an authentic portrayal of the Palestinian side, or at least an attempt to humanize Palestinians in sort of a gritty, like, Israeli version of Homeland. So you have this crack, this like A-team, these undercover operatives like Doron, who's sort of like retired to life in a vineyard, and then is basically brought back to help capture Abu Ahmed, or the Panther, who is meant to be the Bond villain, I guess, of the show. He's a Hamas operative in the West Bank, which in and of itself is funny. But and then the show kind of moves to different locations in each of the seasons. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that, Dani.
So you think that basically Fauda is completely an inaccurate portrayal of the Palestinian narrative of the conflict, right?
Yeah, I mean, I hated it as far as narrative portrayal goes, and we'll kind of get into why. But it's not for any of the surface level reasons. Like I kind of expect a TV show to be inaccurate. I expect a TV show to focus on the thrilling, exciting stuff rather than like the mundane day-to-day lives of people. Even though in a lot of ways, yeah.
But then when it claims that it's trying to humanize the Palestinians, and then you feel the narrative is portrayed in an incorrect manner, so you feel it basically didn't do its job or what it stated it was supposed to do.
Well, I kind of, it's like you really can't humanize a person without understanding their like most basic motivations or the most basic aspects of their worldview. And we'll kind of get into that along the way, but it's really these high level narrative stuff, and I feel like the show in a lot of ways, and I was shocked when you explained that it was your reaction to it, because to me it reinforces what I think Israelis think the conflict is about, or like the narrative I think Israelis have of the way they see Palestinians. And certainly like the security narrative and like their understanding of what motivates Palestinian resistance. Israeli viewers seemed shocked. It was interesting.
Well, yeah, because my view on the show is that it was groundbreaking. First of all, it's just a really good show, right? Just as an action show, like forget the conflict, all the drama and the suspense. You're just like, oh my God, every episode leaves you hanging like, what's going to happen? And, I went through like an emotional roller coaster seeing it the first time. The second time I saw it, I was trying to be really critical because, you and I are doing this show. And I really wanted to see the small nuances and kind of like motifs that are repeated. And I agree with you that largely they didn't portray the conflict as it is. But what it did do was humanize the other side for me. I didn't feel like the Palestinians in the show were vilified at all. I felt that they were literally just this different side of the same coin, and basically both sides were the outcome of the circumstances that they've been in, and we can get more into that later, but I just felt like it was groundbreaking for an Israeli show, one, to show things and raise topics that I've never seen in an Israeli show. So whether it was even just seeing checkpoints, or even if it was inaccurately portrayed, but just the fact that you see, the difference in how soldiers, their attitude towards a Palestinian crossing by a checkpoint, and then if an Israeli or a Jew, passes by a checkpoint. And the fact that on the first episode, in the beginning, they talk about occupation, which is just like, you talk to a lot of Israelis, and of course, there are Israelis who will agree and say, of course, there's an occupation. Then there will be others who's like, what occupation? Like, you can't occupy a land that's yours. They're free to leave or whatever. The fact that, none of the Palestinians were born to hate. That is something that you see in the show. Mothers loving their children more than they hate the Zionists. So debunking that. So for me, it was just kind of like, wow. And I was so shocked that Israelis responded so well to the show. And I just wondered if they realized all the subtle critique and nuances that the show was trying to portray, or they just saw it like I did the first time around, just like a really good action show. So that's my take on a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost not surprised that it was so well received. Like, uh, based on all the conversations and all the sort of debates and stuff that I've had, I think it's exactly. I think the show is exactly what Israelis think the conflict is. And so even when it's like being brave for an Israeli TV show, in that it's like depicting the operatives as flawed, or behaving immorally in like certain scenes as sort of like a function of necessity. I think that is exactly what uh, Israelis who are remotely aware of the conflict kind of think about it big picture. Um, so yeah, I think there's this insidious thing where because you feel it's being authentic, um, you feel like, okay, now I understand it. And there's a lot more to humanizing someone than just showing them, like eating and drinking and talking to their family. Like, he never actually explains the Palestinian narrative even briefly, or even through their lens, and just from like a pure, literary or film critique, and the characters are all, to me, extremely shallow. Um, it's interesting that I could barely empathize with them, like the Palestinian characters on the show. They weren't us. They really weren't us. Like what they were motivated by, and what drove them to do what they did. But I think maybe let's start by making it more tangible. Adar, if you want to bring up that first scene. Um, Adar?
Is this
yeah.
it?
No,
the
the
one
wedding.
before it. The
Yeah.
wedding scene.
Okay, hold on. We'll figure this out.
Shwaya, shwaya.
We got this.
By the way, the show, I wrote down so many words here in Arabic. I'm just like.
Wait, Dani, you told me that was the first scene.
No, that was my first scene. He sent you.
Oh, the one you sent
Yeah.
me. Okay, yeah, sure. Of course, no problem.
No.
So the audio is missing from the clip, but
Yeah.
the show starts as sort of the first episode, where basically you have the operatives come in. They're there to try to capture, or they have intel that Abu Ahmed's, going to be at the wedding of his brother, and basically, the brother gets caught in the crossfire, so to speak. He goes to defend his wife, and then he gets shot by the operatives. And I think that scene kind of recurs, at least in its themes, over and over again throughout the video, throughout the TV show. So the vast majority of the characters on the show are driven by a sort of vendetta, so a desire for revenge. And there's this like Montagues and Capulets thing, whether it's Amal or Abu Ahmed or all of the characters throughout the show. The motivation for Palestinian resistance in Fauda is usually a vendetta. It's very personal, and you'll see this sort of throughout different scenes. But there is no depiction of what I think the primary, cause or motivation for Palestinian resistance or the violence is. So the show is sort of trying to depict, the actions of these characters as being driven by like the loss of a family member or a desire to avenge attacks. And I think like while the loss of a family member is traumatic in a lot of cases, that can be like what pushes someone over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
The show never really depicts the what I think the other primary motivations of the conflict. There is no depiction of effectively the tyranny of military rule. So there is very little military presence inside the West Bank. Part of that is that you're sort of seeing these undercover operatives, but you don't see soldiers imposing curfews on an entire town. There's no raids into people's homes in the middle of the night. You get these undercover
There
agents.
are raids, just raids for a specific
There are, I think what
mission, or
you guys
because they're
think raids
looking for
are.
people.
Yeah, well, I think that's what Israelis think raids are. Maybe.
Can you expand? Because I don't. What are raids if not like literally coming in and effing shit up? Like, they're throwing everything all over. You see the Palestinians in the show just standing still. Palestinians, from my conversations, they talk about how important dignity is, and how, dignity is probably, and pride is one of the only things that they have, that is theirs, due to the occupation, that they hold dearly. And raids and in general, the occupation tries to humiliate you and dehumanize you and turn you into this little nothing. And then I felt that was portrayed, like, even though it was a terrorist's home when they were doing the raids, I felt along with the character uncomfortable. I felt like someone was, invading my home and stirring shit up. And it's just like, and, Israelis don't talk about night raids at all. Like we're completely.
The raids are so routine. So they're this big dramatic thing in the show where they're there looking for someone. The raids are part of like a larger military apparatus.
Right.
They're so routine that we can almost tell when they're going to happen, and they're not necessarily to get anyone in particular. So, I remember staying up. So if something happens, like, something happens the previous week or someone is shot, I remember people will like stay up in expectation of a raid, knowing rather than basically being woken up in the middle of the night, it's better to stay up waiting for this raid to happen. And like often the raids aren't there to get anyone; they're either using your property as a place to conduct surveillance, or it's an establishment of presence thing, or they'll raid an entire apartment block. The raids and the experience of the soldiers is you constantly see a foreign military. They're in uniform, en masse. You have like 20 trucks into the area. One funny thing to me in the show is like given the guy that they were trying to capture in like the real life version of this, is they would have put the entire town on lockdown. I remember growing up like curfews.
They did, especially in season 3. They went and put everything on lockdown. They also talked about it, the Palestinians, like, we're going to be in lockdown. We're not going to be able to move. We're not going to be able to cross anything. Like, that was said in the 3rd season for sure. I wrote it down. And regarding the first clip that we saw, I was intrigued that, right before that scene, I think it was Bashir's uncle. I don't know who the guy was, but I quoted what he said. He said it was at Bashir and Amal's wedding. So the same scene. When I see you, Bashir, and you, Amal, I say to myself that this is the best revenge. Despite all that the occupation has done to us, we still bear children. We're successful. We raised families. Why did I write have children again? And prosper. Basically, he says our existence is the biggest resistance. And so to the occupation. And so even though it was touched on really shallow, just the opening scene, and you don't talk about it much anymore, that was like, for an Israeli, in your face. Like, here, this is the first scene that you get when you look into the life of the Palestinians, is that they take pride in their existence, that this is, it is a big part of their resistance, that they talk and they said the word occupation. Like,
I think that scene
we don't talk about it. We don't say kibush. We don't say occupation. Just so you know.
That scene is one of the few scenes in the show where I feel like the character is at least speaking normally, or speaking the way we speak, or talking in like fairly normal, a fairly normal way for Palestinians to speak. Although I don't know about that happening at a wedding, but that aside.
And also, the Israelis used Palestinians, they used Amal as a human shield, right? And then Bashir wants to come and attack, and then they kill Bashir, and then, Amal is left widowed on on the day of her wedding. So these are things also that you see that are kind of like, I don't know if Israelis took notice to it, right? But we always claim Israelis.
But they're
Hamas
sort of in the
is
heat of the
human
moment.
shield, but still it's a human shield, and it's something we say we don't do at all. And then yet you see
sure.
it.
But it's sort of in the heat of the moment, and like you're seeing these people. It's all very circumstantial. While and so I'm watching it. And I'm like, this just isn't reality. Like this is neither how the soldiers behave. They're kind of behaving in more dramatized ways than they really do, which is far more professional, but also like methodical, and also mundane. Like this is mundane life, and there's almost no point in depicting the Palestinian characters like lives. A fair bit of time is spent setting up their backstory and like what motivates them if you're not going to show what they're really upset by. And so one of the very first points is freedom or liberty, and like a natural reaction to oppression. So there's no depiction of random beatings. There's no depiction of all the men in the neighborhood being rounded up. There's no depiction of just mundane humiliation. So a normal interaction with a soldier where he's just bored and is messing with you.
In season 1, episode 8, Nisreen, which is the wife of Abu Ahmed, wants to go through a checkpoint to see her daughter, and is asked to strip at the checkpoint, and she feels very uncomfortable. And the soldier's like, "Yalla, yalla, see, do it already, like do it already."
All these characters are not. Like you kind of see all this happen after they've been caught up in the violence, and that I think is actually part of the narrative. It's like all of this is happening to them after they've been caught up in the violence, and I think it's the exact same way Israelis speak about like Hamas and Gaza. There's this sense of basically, if it wasn't for Hamas, or if it wasn't for these terrorists, then there wouldn't be any violence. And so all of the characters in the show, whether it's Nasreen or at the checkpoint, or the fact that the brother of Abu Ahmed dies, are in some way like collateral damage of Palestinian violence. So, if Abu Ahmed wasn't a terrorist, then his family wouldn't have been caught up in this conflict. She's there at the checkpoint, but you're seeing this happening to her because she's under watch. She's literally being escorted to the hospital to see her daughter. And they're checking her. She's the wife of Abu Ahmed, and so they're taking extra precautions. It all sort of makes sense. You're seeing this happen through the lens of like this one family, rather than basically seeing this as the motivation for why the violence begins in the first place. Like literally living under oppression. So every aspect of your life being controlled, having no real opportunity. You can't open a business. You can't, do anything without approval from a country that doesn't represent you. These soldiers control every aspect of your life, despite the fact that they're not there to protect you. I will be stopped, and they'll ask for my ID, and I am not treated like a citizen. It's not a police officer who's there to look after your interests. You are a threat. And if they're in a good mood, it's a normal, mundane interaction. And if they're in a bad mood, it can be a humiliating interaction. And so you are always constantly at the mercy of this different group of people.
You did say something interesting, though, Zahir. You said that the show portrayed that if Hamas didn't exist, then there wouldn't be this terror, this violence. But Hamas is Dafka portrayed as the one who
no, I'm disagreeing with that.
Order.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing with that notion. Yeah,
but I've been told that Hamas has condemned lone wolf attacks because it wants to monopolize these terror attacks, not for the sake of terror, but for the sake of having a bargaining chip against Israel when negotiating for their rights, or for bettering their conditions, or for returning prisoners. In season 2, episode 2, Abu Samara calls Nadil the new terrorist, right? Because you had Abu Ahmed with season 1, and then you have Nidal. Why did I say Nadil? Nidal. I wrote it wrong. And he explains to Nidal how lone wolf attacks are so dangerous to, first of all, Palestinian lives, that it needs to go through them, because through them, they're able to do it in a way that is used as a bargaining chip, meaning they know what limits to cross and what don't, in order to, better their conditions. And that, for me, again, was groundbreaking, because you talk to every Israeli, and right away, the first thing we say is, but Hamas, 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 right? Like, that's the thing. But everyone, but Hamas, like, we're just totally flipping shits about, the terror, and thinking that, they're training children to kill us and all this stuff. And yet then the head of, the Hamas quarter in the West Bank is saying, we don't terrorize to terrorize.
Yeah, I mean, it's politically motivated.
It's strategy. It's politically motivated. Exactly.
Sure, it's politically motivated, but I mean, ultimately, it's sort of their fault, right? Like, or it's a Montagues and Capulets thing. That's the way the show depicts it. So, Abu Ahmad is motivated by the fact that he's trying to get revenge, or at least the attack, and then the fact that I don't know how you can see him as not being vilified, given the guy is basically out to create a sarin gas attack inside Israel, and you have no idea what his motivations are. He's basically a generic Bond villain. He's like every other character from the show. I mean, he's totally replaceable as well. I mean, he could literally be any other Muslim Arab terrorist.
Well, in season 3, Hila, how do you say Diskait in English? She's the one behind the computer screen, the one telling the special operatives. First of all, there's a question. Someone asked what language Fauda is in. So it's in Arabic, and it means chaos, just for anyone who's wondering. But Hila, when she talks about trying to get rid of Hani al-Jabriri, or Abu Muhammad, however they call him, she says that, this is a never-ending cycle. It doesn't matter who you take down, there will always be someone to take their place.
Right, and I guess, but you never really understand why, right? Like, why does this keep happening? And the reason for that is that you just don't see the backstory of any of these people's lives. You don't know what they're upset about, other than that, I mean, there's a vague notion that Abu Ahmad is motivated by both a sort of Islamist desire to attack Israel, and then basically revenge at the death of his brother, at least the attack on the nightclub.
And this is a really ignorant question, but are there Christians in Hamas?
Yes. I mean, that's the other thing. It's like,
even though it's Islamist group, can you explain that to me? Like,
well, I mean, I think it's just basically
my head doesn't wrap around it, but it's an Islamist group.
Yeah,
or so they say.
I mean, yeah, I think they're Islamists in the sense that I think they're pragmatic first and Islamist second. But like, ultimately, and this is sort of overall point, is that if you depicted the backdrop of people's stories as to like what they lived through, it feels like a struggle against tyranny. There is no group of people in the world that would agree to live like this. You randomly come into my home, you go through my drawers, and I don't know who you are. You're going to come there in the middle of the night. You're not there to protect me. You're not. This isn't like a SWAT team raiding a house. You're not even necessarily there to get me. Round up, the man, tell them to sit in one room, manhandle my father or my sister or my brother, and then you're going to do this in a mundane, regular way. Like, this isn't some big dramatic mission where they're there to get an operative that's about to use chemical weapons. This is what they do in anticipation of chaos breaking out.
Right, but you do know that Israel prevents so many terrorist attacks. Like, I mean, I'm not talking about 2020 or now because of Corona, But, up until 2019, Israel prevents hundreds, if not thousands of terrorist attacks, even if they're as small and as stupid as, just, someone coming with a knife. Obviously, I'm not saying all of them or even any of them are as clever or as evil. I don't know how you want to describe it as, using chemical weapons, but Israel does prevent these things on a daily. And just like you feel that, it's actually not just like you feel, but I feel like in the show, it kind of, on the Israeli side, the second scene, actually, can we put on the second scene? I just feel like it explains kind of how Israeli soldiers act and why they act the way they do, because they're seen as villainous and evil, who, like, in the international arena, right, who just enjoy killing and enjoy occupying and
Is that this one?
Yeah. If the sound doesn't work, I completely quoted everything, so we can try. So a little bit of context. I don't know if it was heard well. I didn't hear it that well, but what happens is Abu Ahmed and Walid, his second in hand, they kidnapped Boaz, one of the operatives in Doron's team. Doron is the main character, the protagonist of the show. And they, in turn, for Boaz, they kidnap the Sheikh Abdallah, okay, who is like a father and spiritual figure to Abu Ahmed, or you say the Panther, Al-Fahid, right? Am I right? Yeah, okay. And then Nurit is a girl, and this would never happen, by the way, her going as a special operative into Palestinian territories. Believe me, I know you can't do it. And so she starts crying when they see that the Israeli operatives are torturing this man, and this man looks at Nurit and begs her to stop them, looking for her to some compassion as a woman. And she turns around and leaves the building and starts crying. Then she asks Avichai, the guy who was speaking, how do you guys do it? And he basically compared himself to, and in general, the team into fighting dogs. Basically, they are trained to act, not to question. And when they do act, they have to disassociate themselves from reality in order to be able to do the things that they're doing. They have to disconnect from what's going on. And Avichai and a lot of other characters throughout the show repeats it as kind of being semi-dead. Semi-dead because you can't allow yourself to be a person. You can't allow yourself to act like a father or a friend or a brother. You can't allow yourself to feel, because once you feel, you can't actually carry out the missions or the orders that are given to you. So he says, did you ever see a fight dog get an order to attack? He does it immediately. Nothing else matters to him. He pounces with the aim to kill. He doesn't care if his head gets chopped off doing it. We, Nurit, are just like these dogs. That's how we are trained. We have to dissociate ourselves. We need to disconnect. It's like being dead. And so understand that the soldiers who are doing the raids, or the soldiers who are, ordered to shoot or do any of these things that seem humane. I'm not saying all of them are great and they just, have to disconnect. There's shitty people everywhere. And I'm sure there's shitty soldiers in the IDF, but let's just take it like your everyday person. They have to disconnect themselves. They don't want to do this. They don't want to inflict pain. They don't take joy in occupying.
I just don't think I didn't really take issue with those seeds though. And I guess that's what I expect the show to do in sort of explaining what the soldiers are going through and what motivates them. But I don't really feel like I don't know how to express enough that what the show is depicting is a fictional reality. So the people involved in the show who are harassed, who are subjected to, whether it's the Serena, the checkpoint, or the raids, are all directly related to, are all directly connected to this guy who is about to conduct an attack with chemical weapons. Of course, you're going to feel as a viewer, do whatever is required to stop that attack. This
Would
is
you
just
say the same if Israel has to prevent hundreds and hundreds of terrorist attacks?
it's beside the
Because
point.
that's the reality, though.
Yeah, but you never understand why the violence, what motivates the violence, which is that we are living under your military rule. And that is the point. This isn't something that's happening to one person or two people. There isn't a family in the West Bank who's familiar with the raids. How many possible Hamas operatives could there be in the entirety of Palestine? It's like 50,000 people, 100,000 people. 2.8 million people live in the West Bank. All of them live under the military rule. This is our mundane aspect of our lives. This isn't this dramatic scene where they're there to, get this Bond villain out from. Putting aside the fact that the entire kind of premise is inaccurate or silly, and that it's like a Hamas operative rather than like the PFLP, or like where they're located or the nature of the attacks, which since the Second Intifada are like more lone wolf attacks of somebody stabbing someone at a checkpoint or firing at soldiers or hitting them with a car. The show is constantly trying to reinforce this narrative that this is very much about security, rather than like the reason Palestinian popular resistance exists is because no group of people on earth are willing to be subjugated to tyranny. It's like sex semper tyrannis. You are controlling my life in every way. What gives you the right to come into my home? What gives you the right to control my banking? What gives you the right to control my movement? What gives you the right to control my movement from a town, two Palestinian towns? Why are you there? When you say security, it's like, well, why do you think we are attacking you? Like, it's not just because you exist, it's because of what you're doing to us, both historically and what you're still doing today. It's not like we live in a system, it's not like, Israelis want to live as equals with Palestinians and Palestinians just won't have it. It is, I don't really take issue with any of the scenes that try to humanize the soldiers. It doesn't matter to me because I feel their mission is fundamentally evil. There is sort of no moral way to do it. And I've interacted with soldiers who were very, very nice, were very, very, very pleasant. And there was no pleasant way to do what they were doing. There is no present way to have segregation. There's no present way to deprive someone of their civil rights. I mean, you're just basically very politely doing an evil thing. And that's what we feel. It isn't about, like, do I understand what the soldier is going through? I've met, and in fact, I can
for
tell.
me, it's important, because you might not demonize them, but the international arena sure does a good job of demonizing them. And so for me, especially when we're having, this discussion live, and I don't know who's watching it, if it's only Israeli Palestinians or people from all over, like, for me, it is important to point out that, no, we're not inherently evil. Just like, for example, for some reason, Palestinians have to explain that to Israelis as if it was just like, not obvious to people that no person is born inherently evil.
Right, and so I'll kind of move on from this point, but I don't think at any point are the motivations of Palestinians understood, even putting aside ideology. I mean,
You did remind me, though, something. So you said everyone does it out of revenge, right? But in season 2, Abu Maher, who is like, Abu Mazen in the show, his son, Maher, obviously Abu Maher, he wants to join the resistance because of the occupation and because the Zionists stole their land, and he's not, and he lives under occupation. And there was actually a scene about it. Now, this scene that I'm going to ask Adar to put on talks about the Israeli narrative as to how they see, their existence, and probably explains why Abu Mazen has these security coordinations with Israel. But right beforehand, it's just because I couldn't put a scene longer than 30 seconds. They're in Tel Aviv Yafo. They're speaking just, the two. And, Abu Maher is like, how beautiful is this place? And he says it's beautiful, but it's not ours anymore. So, like, they took it from us. And then Abu Maher says the following. So the volume didn't work. But in general, he says, you know, do you honestly think that you can destroy all those structures, annihilate all of Israel, bring down all those buildings, you know? And then he says, and then Maher adds, no, Dad, they're just buildings. And he says, no, son, they're not just buildings. Do you realize what kind of industries exist here? That the economy here is just like America. It's not like the rest of the Middle East. There are startups here like in Silicon Valley in America. And most importantly, people here get to live. They don't want to die. Wake up, they're not simply going to vanish. Now, I'm not saying that this is a right portrayal. What I'm saying is that this quote is able to sum up the Israeli narrative and what they wish Palestinians could see when, you know, they try to attack and destroy the Zionist state. The fact that if you are to be part of this country, you'd be part of a booming economy. And, you know, for some reason, I mean, we can talk actually about the reason why Israel is different than every other Middle Eastern country in the region. And then he says, wake up, you know, wake up. They're not going anywhere. And I feel like Israelis
I just
think,
think that was tangential.
yeah,
Like,
okay.
we don't think the Palestinians aren't upset because of all these Israeli startups.
No, of
all
course
these
not.
Israeli buildings.
I'm not saying they're upset because of it. I'm just saying these are the quote stated was what Israelis kind of want Palestinians to see. Like, you know, living under our rule would be better for you. I'm not saying necessarily under occupation, but just under the Israeli state would be better because we are unlike any other state in the Middle East.
I mean, yeah, I kind of first of all, it feeds into this idea that like when you know you hear Palestinians want to destroy Israel, like we're there to like take down your startup buildings and your industry and whatnot, and it's like again, it just says nothing about what people's narrative or motivations are. So, I mean, we already live under your rule. It's terrible. You know, it's fundamentally like about putting the rights of one ethnic group over the other. I mean, that's the point of the whole thing. I mean, it's why you know, one state isn't an idea that's ever going to be popular in Israeli society. It's a demographics thing, and then the military rule is basically the reality of how you achieve that. Like in a land with, you know, effectively a 50-50 population, you know, it's like half Arab and half Jewish. How do you basically run that country, control those borders, given that why would the other half of the country agree to live under the rule of one ethnic group? People have a fundamental notion of fairness. You know,
about what? Fundamental notions of?
A fundamental notion of fairness or equality. You know, we can recognize it. It's like animal nature. Israel has never treated Palestinians as equals. We're treated like cattle, whether it's at, you know, checkpoints or the way soldiers treat us when they're in the West Bank. You know, we're treated as guests in the country that we were born in, our fathers were born in, our grandfathers were born in, our great grandfathers were born in, and we've lived in generations. And then people are surprised that we want to resist that. People are surprised that we refuse to live under, the ethnic rule of another group. So, yeah, I mean, I don't. I guess I'm surprised that Israelis think that we don't understand that. I mean, for a start, so much of the West Bank works in Israel. So it's not like we don't have interactions with Israeli industry or Israeli people. Uh, you know, that's not the issue. It's the ideology that underlies like all the interactions that we have, which is basically that this is your country and we're guests in it, and it would be would be saving you a lot of hassle if we all just went elsewhere. I mean that's why you refer to us as Arabs rather than Palestinians most of the time. There's just this sense of well, they can be anywhere. Why are they here hogging up this place as ours? And that's how we're treated all the time. Even Arab Israelis who supposedly have equal rights still live in a country which has a Jewish nation state law that basically effectively disenfranchises their identity from the state. And
yet they vote for Bibi. Not all of them, but still, it just.
I mean, that's a very.
It baffles me. It just baffles me, like.
But I guess you can't claim to be humanizing a group of people if you never explain what their lives are like. And I'm not talking about having this like monologue where people explain their narrative or their ideology, because just showing people's day-to-day lives, which are depicted in the show, you're just depicting a different group of people, or more or less like token Palestinians. I mean, you could more or less replace those people with Iraqis or Syrians or any other group of Arab Muslim characters that are upset at the influence that a different state has had on them, whether it's America. I mean, it's like a common thriller plot, and all of the characters in the show are fairly shallow. But the Palestinians never explain, their attachment to the land. You don't see the lives of farmers, the destruction of olive trees, their inability to access basic resources, their history there, what this place means to them, why they refuse to leave, despite the fact that it is literally a dead end. I mean, there's no future. There are very few careers where you can sort of imagine a future for yourself. There's no opportunity, and it's entirely because our lives are controlled by a country that we don't vote in, that we aren't part of, that more or less imposes its sovereignty on the entire set of borders. And then we have this like Bantustan regime that is the PA, that we the buck is constantly passed back to them as to why things suck inside our like Palestinian territories, quote unquote, Area A and Area B and Gaza, and then there's the whole like the good Palestinians and the bad Palestinians show. The Israelis love the good Palestinians, whether it's like Dr. Shireen or Bashar. And there's this like savior complex where if only all Palestinians were like this, and it's really funny to me because it basically feeds into the idea that Palestinians have to be rational for wanting to resist living under tyranny. That they have to
be pushed into a stage of desperation. And you have to understand that it's okay. For me, the actors are a symbol of, the IDF and the Israeli state. And what the show shows is how our state has pushed Palestinians into a place of desperation. I mean, had you guys not been put in this place of desperation that, is consequence of us, removing you from the land and then occupying you, would you turn to terrorism? So you're taking the show so literally. That's what I feel like. That's my take. Well, I'm looking at it symbolically, and it could be that I'm completely BSing, the analysis, and it's only because I'm influenced from the several conversations that you and I have had, and I've had with other Palestinians. But I just feel like there's an underlying motif, and it's not that it's revenge because I killed your brother. It's the fact that, Israel has put Palestinians in a place of desperation that make them act in ways that they wouldn't act had they not been put in this situation.
And I disagree with that too, because that's usually like I think the Israel and as a government, trying to act its own rational self-interests, totally understands pushing Palestinians. They actually they have their boots on our necks just enough that there's no intifada, and they know that if they overdo it, people will push back violently. So they do it just enough that people remain sedated. There's enough money that trickles in. There's just enough of an economy. There's just enough opportunity. There's just enough, people getting permits to work. There's just enough of a livelihood that people don't immediately just have a revolution. But there's not so much. There's not so little. I mean, that people will then push back quite naturally. If there, even if our lives were better, our reaction is going to be exactly the same. Ultimately, we aren't going to accept being second-class citizens. No group of people in the world does indefinitely. And I feel like the show it's almost like trying to explain
So
pre-civil rights America.
You're saying that if the Palestinians weren't occupied, then they would still act the same? Because that's what I'm saying. I'm saying had they not been occupied, you being occupied by us has put you in a place of desperation, yes? It doesn't matter if you're living large or you're living, whatever.
Well, I'm more referring to this idea that people think that if we improve the economy and we give people better jobs or better lives and they're financially better off, then the problem goes away. I think that's totally.
So I was referring to the occupation. I was referring to the fact that you guys, that the Palestinians live, unfreely.
Sure, I mean the occupation is in a nutshell, but
and so that
that's
what I'm asking you is if you disagree with me on the statement that had Palestinians not been occupied and not been evacuated by their lands by Israelis, okay, would there still be terrorism or freedom fighters?
What would there be?
Because what I'm stating and what I'm seeing that the show is stating,
I just don't think that's what the show is.
The occupation leads you to desperation and leads you to resist violently. And had you been free to begin with, no one would choose that path, or very little, because again, there's shitty people on each side.
I mean, there would be no freedom fighters if people were free. I mean, that's sort of implied in the term. So I don't know what that means. I mean, just if you're looking at it from historically, the people who lived in 48 lands were going to resist their lands being taken away from them. And the people who are now alive who live in the West Bank are going to resist being dominated in the West Bank. We are also going to resist being denied equality, in whatever form that comes in, whether that comes in the form of two states or, an actual democratic state, is beside the point. At the end of the day, people recognize a basic notion of fairness. And it's one thing for us to fundamentally object to the history, how we got to this point. But lots of countries have an ugly history. Lots of people can look at the past and be like, well, we'll never accept the past, but the past is what it is. It's also the present. We still live like this. I mean, if the show had even made a small attempt at just depicting what people's lives were, what their narrative was, you would sort of understand what the characters were motivated by. And I think it's depressing on both ends, because if you think the conflict is about Palestinians seeking revenge for the deaths of their family members, then you think it's intractable. It's Montagues and Capulets. It's basically this never-ending cycle of violence. It's a vendetta, which is more akin to the way Palestinian, families or the Sicilian mob has problems with each other than the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's a totally different situation.
What would you recommend the Fauda producers and directors, if they were to see this show, this clip of you and I, what could they do differently to more accurately portray the Palestinian narrative in the conflict? you know, given that it's still a show and it's action, but what, you know, small tips or things that they could do.
I think there's other, maybe we can look at this in other TV shows, but just show the backstory to the characters' lives, how they got to the point where they did. Why did Abu Ahmed become Abu Ahmed? What motivated these characters? What did they actually live through? What did they see growing up? You don't have to have many scenes. I mean, plenty of shows. They bothered to include this like wedding scene to explain the motivations of these characters. And you could just have easily included a real scene of what people actually go through. You know, we have a normal human reaction to having freedom deprived from us. It's the same reaction that every group of people has had. And never at any point is that depicted. You see basically Israelis going about their lives, Palestinians going about their lives, and then these pesky terrorists get in the way. You know, these pesky Hamas operatives inside the West Bank that suck in. And Doron's a similar sort of character. Like the people around both Doron and the operatives in both shows, they're the reason for the violence. You know, everyone who's related to them or who knows them by association sucked into the black hole of violence that these characters represent. And it's sort of trying to create this idea that like, you know, if it wasn't for this like Montagues and Capulets thing, then it's all a great big misunderstanding. And why that falls on deaf ears for me is that why people are upset is an experience common to every single person who lives in the West Bank, or every single person who lives in Gaza. This is a state that everybody is in. It isn't, you know.
Well, in Gaza, they're not technically occupied.
Yeah, they're blockaded. And we can, I mean, that's funny in and of itself. Like in season 3, you see these West Bank traders inside Gaza, and a West Bank man getting married to a woman in Gaza, which is
that would never happen. Ken, I saw this scene too, and I was just like, I mean, it could, but it's very difficult, right?
It's more or less impossible. I mean, even just my ability to visit Gaza is extremely limited. It's not easy. I have to apply for a permit well in advance. I have to have an extremely good reason. You know, the intermarriage is another thing that's been cut off. I mean, most people in Gaza are refugees, so they're not from Gaza. They're from places all over the land. And a lot of them are from the exact same families as the people in the West Bank. And now they're totally cut off from each other. My best bet at hanging out with Gazan friends that I have is going to Turkey, and then we can both meet up there. Like there's some very basic research I feel like the show producers should have done. And that really comes across like in a lot of different scenes. So you mentioned this earlier, like, you know, you have this Khalili boxer, this Hebronite boxer. He doesn't have a Hebronite accent, or the fact that there's these scenes where, you know, the Palestinian militants are trying to figure out if the IDF soldier is actually is really Palestinian or whether he's an undercover agent. And he's speaking this like hilarious accent. He's claiming to be from a place that, you know, it would be like saying you're from California in like the most heavy Texan cowboy accent. Like it is really funny. And I guess if they had like any consultants or I don't know, I feel like maybe they got an Arab Israeli opinion on the show, but I don't feel like they had much in the way of a Palestinian influence on the show. And it's entertainment ultimately. Like it's not there to you know, solve the conflict or help both sides understand each other. But it is frustrating to have bothered depicting the lives of Palestinians at all, and never once explaining, you know, their narratives. I mean, Shireen lives a life that maybe the most upper class Palestinians, you know, get to lead. None of the characters make any sense. Abu Ahmed is a generic, you know, Islamic terrorist. You can replace him with, you know, a scene from just about any American thriller. There's no understanding of what motivates him. There's you know, no understanding of what he's lived through, and he's just basically a Bond villain. He's sort of a caricature. There's you know, and like while, you know, the Israeli soldiers are dysfunctional and sometimes they break the law, ultimately they're, part of this like great moral cause. So they are there to protect civilians. They are there to protect the lives of their own people, while the Palestinian militants are out for revenge, or they're misguided in some way. And if they would only see reason, if they were only not mad, even the way that even the way they're described as like radicals,
Mm-hmm.
if only they weren't crazy, then they'd see that they were evil, and that's like a classic shallow Bond villain character. So it would have been nice for the Palestinians to be depicted in at least the same way as the Israeli characters, dysfunctional and flawed, but ultimately part of some cause that sort of makes sense, because they make sense to anybody who lives there. Like if you had
Yeah.
grown up in West Bank, you would understand them, and that's sort of the point, and that's what the show needed to do in order to understand, to really humanize the characters it was claiming to humanize.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because if I may bring up the third scene that we were talking about, it validates what you say, but it also like meaning that it's like coming from vendetta. But it also validates what I say when I feel like in the show, I don't think there was necessarily a good guy and a bad guy. And I felt like in the last episode of season 2, when Nadal captures Doron and his son, he tells him an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You killed my father, I killed yours. You killed my brother, and now I'm going to kill you. And then he says to him, Doron, Doron, can't you tell we're the same? And Doron says, no, we're not the same. I don't kill innocent civilians. And so he is quick to respond, you claim it's not on purpose. Again, I know that it doesn't suffice, I guess, for a Palestinian to see it, and you still feel like Nadal is vilified.
Well, he's misguided.
Or misguided.
Right? So...
Yeah, so it strengthens you in that sense that he's, misguided, or that it comes from a vendetta rather from, a struggle for liberation. On the other hand, to be depicted, and also Doron, when he tries to infiltrate into the Hamas and like become like a terrorist, and he says, I'm a shaheed. I'm a shaheed. A Jew is saying he's a shaheed and he's willing to be a shaheed, meaning to me, maybe again, I was looking at so critically, right? Because of this discussion we were having. I was just like, holy F. They are literally comparing an Israeli operative to a Hamas member and showing them as the same.
Yeah, I guess so. That scene where Doran has that conversation. I guess I would see Israelis hear that scene and then basically respond by saying, "But it isn't intentional," and so immediately dismiss what the character is saying there. Well, it isn't intentional. We're not doing it intentionally, and as far as deliberately wanting to kill civilians, no, I don't think that's intentional. I just think they're collateral damage to the ideology, and that's sort of the point. Somebody's commenting in the chat that
yeah, there's no Palestine and they're Jordanian. I was looking at the comments.
No. Putting that aside, I think Rashi was saying something like, you have a right to defend yourself, right? And then you never see Palestinians defending themselves. They're motivated by revenge. Their motivation is basically simply that they're unwilling to accept, the existence of Israelis, while the Israelis are just trying to protect their own people.
But are they defending? I personally, Dani, right now I'm talking to you as an individual. completely understand why Palestinians, resist. Because again, I live freely. I live as a first-class citizen. If it was the other way around, and we talked about this last video, I definitely resist for, and fight for my freedom. But the question is, do Palestinians protect? Do they defend? Because when they do attack, when they do resist, when they choose violent resistance in particular, they are putting their family in jeopardy. They are putting their loved ones in jeopardy. They are putting everyone they love in jeopardy for their resistance. So I'm not delegitimizing, God forbid, the need to, resist occupation. I'm simply asking you a question. Maybe this could be something we can discuss right now. Is it defending? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, basically, what would you do, right? If if the Israelis withdrew from the West Bank tomorrow, which I know isn't actually possible anymore because now there's like 800,000 settlers in the West Bank. But back in the day when it was all possible, if they had withdrawn from 67 borders in Gaza, do you think there'd still be a conflict today?
I think so.
Why? I mean, it's contrary to exactly what's happened with every other, whether it's Jordan or Egypt.
Because if they had accepted that plan, it would have been reluctantly. I mean, if the plan would have gone through, it would have been reluctantly. No side would have been satisfied. There would have been hostility that could, create the surface for another war. So that's my take.
I don't think any side is ever completely satisfied after the war. I think it's more people would have moved on by now. The new generation would have moved on. It would be like Jordan's relationship with Israel. Instead, there is an ideological desire to continue to have an Israeli presence inside, the West Bank. And so those deals were never possible. It's like it doesn't really matter what your preferred solution is, but if you just begin with the premise that you treat the needs and desires of either group of people as equal to your own, then there wouldn't be a conflict to begin with. I mean, whether it's like simply just one equal democratic state. I mean, both of us recognize the exact same borders are our own. That idea is anathema to most Israeli Jews. And likewise, for an ideological portion of the population that felt it was very important, the connection to the land and inside the West Bank was more important to them than sort of like a two-state political solution. And a similar ideological portion on our side, people from Akka aren't going to accept living in the West Bank. People from Nasra, we are from all over the land. We're not from just the West Bank and Gaza. And so people would never have been happy with that as a solution. But a generation down the line, I don't think there would still be a conflict. And I do largely think that's like out the window today. I don't think that, I personally don't think that is possible. But again, you never really understand, the motivations of any of the Palestinian characters on the show, and none of their actions really seem justifiable. It doesn't seem justifiable to murder, hundreds of thousands of civilians with sarin gas because somebody killed your sister or your brother. That is the motivation of a Bond villain. Rather than depicting basically a struggle for liberation that an entire group of people is experiencing, or a connection to the land, the fact that this is just the only home these people will know. We are from tribes and clans that have lived in particular areas all over the land for generations on generations on generations, and nothing will ever sever that connection. I mean, so you can take one of two approaches. Either focus on the fact that everybody has this connection to the land, and so everybody should live in it. Or you can speak about a desire for equality or freedom or liberation or nationhood. And both approaches kind of ideologically fall on deaf ears. And I think that is what's frustrating about the show, and also just like how the characters engage with each other. Avigdor Lieberman, a defense minister, said, in the Gaza war, that there were no innocent people in Gaza. And that is like the exact opposite of how, the characters behave on the show. They are flawed, they are socially dysfunctional, and they make mistakes. But ultimately, you look at these Israeli undercover operatives and you think, well, they're just there to protect their people. And so you completely understand their motivations, and you see that they're human and how they do it, and sometimes even clearly immoral. And I think that's what Israelis thought was the brave part. But the Palestinian characters are basically just their cause on Fauda is fundamentally wrong. It's motivated by vendettas and by a desire for revenge rather than either liberation.
Yeah, the main characters, but all these supporting characters are portrayed as just people on the other side of the fence, quote unquote, but they're just, it's like Bashar's sister, what was her name? Haifa. When she wasn't willing to rat out what her brother was going to do to the Israelis, and you talk about mashtapim, I'm looking for the word, people who coordinate with Israel, traitors, I guess. You just see her, she's just a faithful sister, a person who's just trying to quote unquote not living her best life, but she's not this evil thing. And even though she doesn't like Zionists, even though she was just you're the reason for my suffering, you don't hate her. You don't say, oh my God, what a B word, I can't believe you, you're just so evil. You just see these people as innocent. That's exactly what they are. And even and I don't see it again as good Arab and bad Arab, because in the last season, when Avichai is interrogated for accidentally killing one of the IDF soldiers in one of their operations that was sent to bring down Abu Muhammad, the interrogator, I don't know if Adar wants to put on the scene. I just feel like it's kind of maybe meh, because there's no...
It's up to you, of course.
There's no audio.
Yeah, hold on, where's my video? Yeah, we gotta figure out the audio for next time, but we'll figure that out, why it's not working. Whoever didn't notice though, there are subtitles though that you can read.
I mean, I quoted it, so if anyone's even watching and just wants to write down the comments what they prefer.
Is it this one?
Yeah.
Cool. Were you able to hear it that time?
Yeah, towards the end.
Yeah, so I figured it out. I just need to be on the screen and then you could hear it. Okay, we figured it out. Problem solved.
For next time. So basically the interrogator asks him about, the IDF soldier, and then he's like, okay, well, what about, this Palestinian child, who was shot? And what about the woman above the bakery? And what about this? And what about that? And, you know, Israelis talk about collateral damage, collateral damage, collateral damage. And we kind of, you know, disconnect ourselves from the people who are these collateral damage. And yet in this scene, you can't escape it. You can't disconnect. Like even the interrogators are like, yo, these are people. These are innocent bystanders. How can you explain this? Now, the scene that was shown defends, right, why you see as much collateral damage as you do. And so that scene was really meant to defend the narrative, but let's just take it aback and let's not defend the Israeli narrative. Let's look at it at the point that the show is talking about Palestinian civilians as innocent bystanders, as people who should not have paid the price of this conflict, and yet they do. And he was suspended because of all the quote unquote collateral damage.
I guess, I mean, the way I feel about that is I feel whenever Israelis are trying to defend their narrative, they're constantly trying to explain why they had no other choice. And insofar as you begin with the goal, the ideological premise, yes, you have no other choice. There is no way to, establish a Jewish majority state in a place that wasn't, without ethnically cleansing the population. There is no way to control 2.8 million people in the West Bank or 2 million people in Gaza without either blockading or occupying them and forcing them to live under military rule. And there is no way to defend yourself other than the way that they do. Yes, it's an inevitable function of the premise. So in that sense, no, I get that portion of it. I get why soldiers do what they do. I get why it's strategic, and what I get what motivates Israelis or the Israeli government or Israeli soldiers. I just think the mission itself is evil. So it's not an inability to understand like why they do it. I also just don't think there was a way for them to do it differently. So I feel like far too much of the focus is placed on like, okay, look at the soldiers behaving immorally in this one case or unprofessionally. And a lot of that does happen.
It's not even immoral or unprofessional. I said, like, in my beginning, I wanted the scene to defend the Israeli narrative, but right now I want to specifically, like you said, you get it, and I'm sure, but what is interesting to me, what is groundbreaking, right? Because my first sentence, like, what do I see about the show in a nutshell, is that it's groundbreaking, is they made you feel attached. It made me feel attached to the collateral damage. The way that Abichai also remembered each and one of his collateral damaged victims, where they were standing, what they were wearing, what was their last expression in their face. It's not something you see talked about. At least I don't hear it. Again, it could be completely, subjective. I don't hear people ever really discussing the collateral damage, besides just defending themselves. But just even putting like, these were kids, or this was a woman, this was an innocent bystander. Like you said, Avigdor Lieberman, he said there is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. So this show shows that that's not the case. Most are innocent. It was a subtle critique, kind of, you can't disconnect yourselves to the Israeli audience of the people.
I'll play devil's advocate. I'll play devil's advocate for the other side, because I think I just don't like, and a lot of human rights organizations and a lot of the focus is placed on like the collateral damage of the conflict. And then there's this push to try to do it more morally, right? So it's like, we're going to drop flyers on people's houses and let them know we're about to bomb the place so that the civilians can leave. We're going to, I don't know who it was who brought up the fact that, like, well, in the Nakba, the Israelis like let the towns know in advance that they were coming. That if they left, it would be fine. And so the violence is just because that they refuse to leave or whatever. And there is a constant desire, and the IDF tries to fixate on this, of like trying to do an immoral thing morally, and I feel it's tangential. Like I just don't. I don't think there's a way to do a good job here. Like I don't know what else you could do. There's cases I can point out where I can go, okay, this is a bad policy. Israel needs to change its rules of engagement here. But this is all tangential because there is just no way to do it that's not going to result in
There's
collateral
no way
damage.
to occupy morally, no matter how morally you may try.
Take Israel trying to defend itself from Hamas rockets. So Israel puts Hamas on Gaza under a blockade because if they don't, they feel that they'll buy weapons and arms. And
they don't feel. It's not a feeling. It's what they're doing. No, it's important. But it's an important nuance. We don't feel like they want to buy weapons to attack us. That's exactly what they're doing. I mean, again, the blockade is inhumane. I feel bad. I feel bad as an individual. The Palestinian, the people in Gaza are blocked off from life. They can't leave. No one can enter. It's just like no man's land. I think that's what season 3 was trying to depict.
But I think the point that Israelis like, yes, the first thing they would do is buy weapons, because why wouldn't they? If the very first thing you're trying to do is protect yourself from future attack, the very first thing you do is buy weapons.
But you're not protecting. They're not like, maybe I'm wrong, but the Israeli narrative is not that they're protecting themselves. Israel left Gush Katif in 2005, and please correct me if I'm wrong and enlighten me, and tried to give the Palestinians a chance at autonomy. Okay? And what Hamas did with that autonomy was take all that money and funnel it to attack Israel.
If you're a brand new sovereign, if you're a brand new, they didn't
not to give it to the people.
Brand new, but that's what every state did, right? The very first thing the state is the very first thing the state does when it gets autonomy is buy weapons and arms. Jordan has plenty of weapons,
defensive and offensive weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see how many airplanes does Hamas have. I mean, nobody complains about Jordan or Egypt or Syria or any other state having arms. If you're a sovereign, if you're supposed to be sovereign, if you're actually independent, then you have a right to buy weapons. And then the usual state incentives exist. A heavily armed Jordan or a heavily armed Palestine isn't necessarily any more likely to attack. That's the whole notion of, and frankly, Hamas could buy weapons from here till, for a very, very long time without being a remotely credible military threat. But that's all beside the point. That's a much longer discussion, kind of tangential to the kind of the point I was trying to make, which is that, rockets are fired at Israel. Israel wants to take out Hamas's ability to do so, and so it does it by bombing.
To take out what? I'm so sorry, I didn't hear you.
To take out Hamas's ability to attack Israel, and so it does it by bombing Gaza. And in the wake of that, this extraordinarily densely populated area, in 2014 Gaza war, 2,000 Palestinians were killed, and 1,400 of whom were civilians, 500 of whom were children, 300 were women. There is a tremendous amount of collateral damage to that. Now, Israelis say, well, what do you expect us to do? We have to take out Hamas. They were attacking us. We're defending ourselves. And it's like, yes, if you begin from these political premises, then this is the only way it's ever going to go. You can drop as many flyers and try to bomb Gaza as morally as you like, but the outcome is going to be you're going to bury children beneath the rubble of buildings, because there is no way to do it morally. It is all or nothing. Like, you're not going to get anywhere with half measures. You can't give people a little bit of freedom. You kind of, pre-civil rights America or Bantustans in apartheid South Africa weren't independence for the people who lived there. Gaza is not independent. It has no control over its borders, no freedom of movement, no control over its government, no ability to build an economy.
What do you mean no control over its government?
Well, I mean, again, that's sort of...
was Hamas not elected? I know that Israel helped Hamas go into power, but was it not elected?
It's a much longer conversation, but ultimately, people's ability to, first of all, Gaza and the West Bank aren't two separate places. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are all part of are all
They're all
Palestinian.
part of the Palestinian nation. That's true. Just the West Bank and the Gaza are two different stories. They're not two different people. It's just two different stories. The West Bank is proper occupied.
The West Bank voted for Hamas as well. They just had their funding cut off, and so their rule was ultimately replaced. Gaza, the story of what happened gets into a much longer conversation about Palestinian politics. But ultimately, Gazans aren't free, and so if you need a complete political solution before the conflict will end, and in the meantime, there is no way to do it morally. And the problem that you come down to today is that Israelis have no incentive to give a shit. This is a side conversation inside of Israeli politics, while we actually live this life. You have relative normalcy, and Israeli politics fundamentally talks about security rather than literally half the population of the land, the map that you see in your head when you think Israel, and I see in my head when I think Palestine. That is made up of literally 50% Arabs and 50%, roughly Jews and other groups, all sorts of different ethnic groups there, Druze, Armenians, and other minorities. But you're looking at like roughly a half, quote unquote, Palestinian group, and roughly a half Israeli Jewish group. And amongst those people, the state is set up into all sorts of weird little administrative regions to distract from the reality that those are the real demographics of the place. The real demographics of the place are basically two groups of people who are living within these same borders. And then you've basically pushed the Palestinian population to a very small amount of territory, and pushed the Palestinian population a small amount of territory in Gaza. And continue to exercise control over their lives in even this very small chunk of the land. And then there is no way to do that. There is no way to do that that's not going to result in collateral damage. You can take as many precautions as possible, but ultimately, this is going to be the outcome every single time. And while for one group of people, this conflict remains extraordinarily relevant, for the other group of people, it probably ranks below like your economy and coronavirus in Israeli politics. So it's not very relevant to Israelis today, and that's something the show doesn't depict at all. It doesn't depict the urgency. It doesn't depict the fact that people really don't know how they're going to continue to be here in 10 years' time. What am I going to do for work? Where am I going to go? I go overseas, I get educated, I come back, and then what do I do for a living? There's no future. And the whole status quo that we're living under depends on this bizarre inertia, this equilibrium that exists between the PA and Israel, which could disappear at any moment. And then we're right back to another intifada. Nothing is going to change until there's a shift in the political ideology that gets us to this point. And so one way or another, you need a full solution. You can't have 1.2 states. You can't give Palestinians, you can't slightly improve people's lives. You actually need to give them equality one way or another, either with an independent Palestinian state where they have their own country, they have their own nationhood, and they have equal rights inside their own state, or with a democratic one. Either way, there's no in between there. And no group of people will ever accept an in between there. It may come in stages, where you have temporary segregation followed by actual civil rights, but still having like redlining and racist measures. But ultimately, the struggle isn't over until people are equal, and that's what's going to happen every single time. It's also inevitable, because what are you going to do with the millions of people that live inside this country that you've disenfranchised? I mean, do you think we're going to go somewhere? We're going to magically disappear? We're going to leave? Like, what do you think the end destination is? And how long do you think people are going to be willing to endure this before it comes to a head?
Okay. Given me a lot to think about and also future content. yeah, so Israelis have the privilege, I guess, to not care. I don't like the word privilege, but I just feel like it suits here. And that's something that Fauda, I guess, trying to depict in some way, shape, or form the conflict, has failed to show the urgency on the side of the Palestinians to find a solution. What it is that brings them to resist, not just vendetta. A vendetta could be like a symptom, but it's not the cause. Could you acknowledge, though, that as a first step to bringing the conflict to the stage to Israelis, that it is something, it is progress. It's not nearly enough, and a show will never give Palestinians what they deserve, which is freedom. But could Palestinians appreciate the attempt of the people on this show to at least show a glimpse, try to humanize? Could you appreciate the fact that it is progressive to what any Israeli has seen until today? Or it just doesn't mean shit so long as, you know, the situation is a situation?
I'll sort of wrap up, but I would say it is ultimately a TV show. You know, it's not a documentary. It's not trying to explain the conflict to the audience. What was frustrating about it was the narrative aspects. So you could strongly disagree with what the Palestinian narrative is. But these aren't things that we disagree on. It's not like Israelis don't think the raids happen, or the checkpoints exist, or the curfews exist, or this isn't something like this. Is just a, you know, like a factual reality. So you can depict that. You can depict the day-to-day experiences of people's lives. What I felt the show did is depicted a fictional reality. And maybe it's because it had Arab Israeli consultants rather than like people from the West Bank chiming in or whatever. But it explained nothing about what people's lives were actually like, what they actually lived, and then leave the audience to draw their own conclusions. So it's not that it had to, this Israeli TV show had to basically advocate for, Palestinians. I didn't expect it to do that. I just think when you show Palestinian characters, at least show their lives the way they really are, which are actually quite mundane. I mean, so much of the conflict is this really mundane thing. The occupation is very normal. You know, it's routine. It's routine to us, and it's routine to the soldiers doing it. We can tell the different groups we come into contact with as well. Like, different groups of soldiers wearing different uniforms behave very differently in raids or at checkpoints or in our interactions with them. Well, that is the backstory to people's lives, and that is the backstory to their motivation. And that's why a new generation that didn't see the history with their own eyes.
You're on mute. Like, you finished your statement, Zahir?
I think I dropped out for a second. But
Yeah.
that's why a new generation that didn't see the history with their own eyes is still very much living this struggle. So you're never going to explain the full narrative or the history of both sides in a TV show. But just the day-to-day mundane experiences, like what it's like to actually live there, that is never depicted. And then the Palestinian characters are completely interchangeable with any other group of, Islamic terrorists from any other Arab state. They were shallow from like a literary or film perspective. They weren't compelling characters. And there's a lot more to humanization than just showing somebody be human, have kids and a family, and eat food at a dinner table. You have to, at least, even if you don't agree, even if you simply think they're wrong about their narrative, you at least have to say what they say, what they think, what they believe. And the show doesn't do that at any point. And that's where most of my gripes with it was. I had very low expectations. It it just, everything it fixated on was I mean, it's exactly what I think Israelis think the conflict looks like in their head. And even just it is all very visceral. Like if you see if you see a group of people oppressed, or you see a group of people without liberty in really basic mundane ways, rather than these like dramatic scenes where they're like kidnapping a kid and using her as a hostage, they're just really basic day-to-day scenes. You would at least understand what we are thinking, and the show doesn't do that at any point. And so you were left aware of the existence of violence and aware of the existence of conflict, but no understanding as to what motivates it. And it is also kind of hopeless, because if you believe the narrative the show is pitching, which is basically the conflict exists because of a cycle of vendettas, or because of Islamic extremism, then
it does state the occupation not once, not twice, and not even thrice in the show. So we can. I agree with. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just agree
it's left us
to
a vapid
disagree, because
we say occupation, but you just never see it. Throughout the entire show, you never actually see what occupation looks like.
But they try.
That's how I felt.
That's the thing. You still need to sell it to Israeli people at the end of the day. You know what I mean? So I just feel like this was a huge first step. And obviously, it's not perfect. Obviously, there's so much to progress. And also, it's a drama TV show. But I really appreciated the conversation today, because I really didn't see anything of what you were saying. And so now you explaining that to me, I kind of see, your perspective on the show. I just hope I somewhat enlightened you with tiny motifs or critique that, the show was trying to portray to Israelis and their viewers, and say, like, this might not be a lot, but it's something. And just one step is another step closer. So, again, I may be looking at it that way because I'm an Israeli and I don't have this sense of urgency to,
yeah, I mean, I felt it was like a step backwards in a way. I feel like enough Israelis serving the army have seen the West Bank. They know what's real. They know what's mundane. They know they know what these things are really like. It is a lot more like living under
soldiers at 18. It's different. It's different when you're raised, like I talk to students. I'm a teacher, right? So I have like kids, and they're like, oh, I was telling them that I do this thing on the Great Debate, and we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they're like, what's that? And I'm like, oh. Like, you're just gonna like, Tove, I don't want to be the one teaching you about it, because you're the kids, and I don't want the parents to come to me and say, like, Dani, what are you teaching my children? And I was just like, oh, it's just conflicts. It's regional conflicts. I talk about regional conflicts. I mean, the older they are, I feel freer to speak about it, but with little kids, I'm just like,
I just can't think of any other.
When
I can't think of any other
as a soldier than when you see it as an individual, when you're raised on it. When you talk about it,
I just can't think of any other piece of history or conflict between two ethnic groups that you can kind of get away with depicting so shallowly. If you're going to show Palestinians, just show real Palestinians. Like, what do they live like? In a lot of ways, what the Israeli soldiers did on the show wasn't realistic for Israeli soldiers, like both in a positive way or a negative way. But our lives, to me, it felt like you were just depicting a different group of people, and there were only brief moments in the show where I could actually resonate with what the characters were experiencing or saying. And I think film and media and TV is an extremely powerful way of explaining what people experience and making it real. I definitely, I wasn't remotely expecting this to be a pro-Palestinian TV show. I just think if you're going to go to the trouble of creating these characters and giving them a backstory, just base it off a true story. There is so much disagreement about narrative and who's right. But I mean, there are some basic facts. You can take the stories of any of the people who've been part of recent attacks or history, use them on the show, and at least it would make sense to us. At least you would feel like you're depicting real people, rather than shallow characters. And that's probably how I felt about the show in a nutshell.
Yeah. So if the Fauda producers are watching, y'all need a Palestinian to enlighten your narrative a little bit and depict it more accurately.
What season is Fauda on?
Season 3 was the last one.
Season 3. So Fauda producers, you have some good feedback. Let's get season 4 going. Let's do this. Maybe one of our awesome community members wants to tweet this video. Let's get it going. So do you want to take some questions, some audience questions?
Sure.
Yeah. By the way, that was great. I only watched the first episode of Fauda, but I really found the conversation to be meaningful. So, audience, let's ask some questions for Dani and Zahir. And do you also want to do an after party in the lounge?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'm down.
All right, so we're gonna take 2 questions, and then we're gonna move over to Discord. We're gonna do an after party at the lounge where it's just a free conversation. It's text and voice channels, just a party, just good times. I don't want to explain too much. We'll leave it mysterious. I just dropped the link in the chat. Join that. On the left-hand side, you'll see a lounge. We'll be in there as soon as we log off. Maybe while people are asking some questions, I'll give some feedback on some of the comment section. Honestly, the comment section was by and large peaceful today. But I saw a little denialism of Palestinian identity, and we see denialism of both identities. It's kind of 2 sides of the same coin. For a minute, I'll get into the specifics. Like the concept of Palestine doesn't exist. Well, 180 countries in the world and the UN recognize Palestine as a de jure sovereign state. And what's interesting is it's also the UN that recognized Israel's right to exist initially. So, A, there's that, but B, a nation is not just a physical concept of borders and government and military. It's a social and emotional construct as well. And no nation exists until the day it exists. So to say Palestine didn't exist doesn't mean that they don't exist as a people or a nation today. But even more importantly than the semantic itself, it's what do you gain to achieve by saying Palestine doesn't exist? Do you think you can ever convince a Palestinian that Palestine doesn't exist? Think about this. Will you ever convince a Palestinian that Palestine doesn't exist? You have probably the same chance of convincing an Israeli that Israel doesn't exist. It's a 0% chance. So it's pretty much a waste of an argument. But not only is it a waste of an argument, it's inflammatory. So not only are you not going to convince Palestinians, you're just going to anger them. And when they're angry, they're going to react the same way towards you. So anybody who's denying one side's identity is only strengthening calls for denial of their own identity. Think about that. You are calling for the denial of your own identity by denying the other side's identity. So, let's keep our the comments and our thoughts and our activism. It should be productive. It should be helpful. It should be progressing a cause, not trying to deny one side's existence. Just keep that in mind. Cool. Questions. Itachi, thank you. You've been active this whole time and you were by and large respectful, so I appreciate you. Itachi's asking, what would you like to see in the next Fauda season?
Zahir, you want to take this one, or?
I don't know if they could pull it off, because it would be such a departure from everything that we've seen so far. But just show normal people's lives. I mean, Dani mentioned that Palestinians on the show said the word occupation, but you just never see it. You just have no reason to understand what they're talking about. What are they referring to? What does it look like? What do they experience? There's no depiction of crowd control of protests or just being told you aren't allowed to go out at night after a particular hour, or week-long curfews where everybody's stuck at home, or I don't know. I mean, just fairly basic, now mundane aspects of what occupation is. And even if you don't agree, even if you don't buy into the Palestinian narrative, it sort of doesn't matter. At least depict a factual reality that everybody sort of can agree on, which is like, what does this look like? And how I think the audience can fill in the gaps. I mean, we are all human. We can look at an interaction. You can see this in videos or in photographs of any of the conflicts. You can look up. This is so widely available online. And as soon as you watch a video of this happening in real life, you understand the narrative right away. And that is why film is powerful. More so than me, I can tell you in my words what a raid feels like, or how mundane it is, or why it feels like basically an attempt to dominate or establish presence in the places that they're located. But a film can depict that. And if you want to depict the Israeli side of that narrative, or why they're motivated to do that, well, that's on the onus of that is on the show's writers. But at least show the thing that happens. Show the reality, and the audience can sort of immediately understand what the characters are experiencing. And frankly, I think it makes for better drama. They're less shallow characters. Their motivations make more sense. And so I think the Israeli characters sort of made sense in the show. Regardless of when they behaved immorally or were dysfunctional or needed some mental health support. They ultimately, the show kind of explains their cause. You're left feeling that they're there to protect their, people. While the Palestinian characters never really made any sense. They never made sense to me, and I'm Palestinian. So the characters just seemed like generic, angry, Arabs, rather than Palestinians.
Well, I love the show again. So what you recommended that now I'm super like, again, if anyone in Fauda, working in Fauda is watching this, I super want to see it, is the background stories. What made the person that we're seeing today, the person he is today, okay? Whether it be well, I mean, Israelis, we know our narrative. So yeah, if we're trying to humanize and get to understand the Palestinian narrative, I would kind of want to see, so if it was Abu Ahmed or Nidal or Abu Muhammad, so whoever's going to be the next guy in season 4, I just kind of want to see his life story in one that is accurate to the portrayal of the everyday life Palestinian. That's what I want to see in season 4.
Zahir, I have a question that I know you're gonna like. Is there any chance to ever convince Palestinians of Israel's right to exist? Thanks, Marla.
Yeah, that it's a big question, and it kind of fundamentally comes down to what you mean Israel's right to exist. Do you mean Israel as it is today? With the occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, or it depends on what matters to you ideologically. Do you mean a state that exists only for one ethnic group, or do you mean your right to you're born there, or you're a third generation or a Sabra, as Israelis say, and your right to be in this place that you call home? Do you mean even when Israelis say a Jewish state, what exactly does that mean? Is it a state where Jewish people have gathered, or is it about Jewish history, or is it about a Jewish homeland, or does it mean the ideological supremacy of one ethnic group over every other? So I really can't answer that question until Israelis figure out what exactly it means to them.
So let me give you a version of Israel that I think most Israelis probably would, this would be like what they won't be willing to compromise on. It would be a Jewish majority state, meaning a country where they can keep demographic control primarily for security reasons.
I don't think Palestinians will ever accept the history. I do think that, like, unanimously across the board, all of our leadership and people have, time and time again, accepted the basic premise of two states. Along like UN partition lines or 67 borders or whatever. Yeah, I mean, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and genuine, honest to God sovereignty. That's a staple of every political party. Even Hamas is, which Israelis seem to think is this like crazy extreme thing. Yeah, I've been completely on board with that as a premise. Alternatively, there is equality. You can let go of the idea that an ethno-state is important, and have a homeland instead. This isn't diaspora Europe. This isn't. You're not 2% of the population or 1% of the population. You're half the country. So if everybody had equal rights in the land that we all consider our homeland, a lot of Israelis see that as a destruction of their existence. And so, if your state is about demographics, then you've gone about it exactly the wrong way. You shouldn't have let 800,000 settlers move to the West Bank. I don't really see a way back from that. I see the future as inevitably, going to require somebody to shift on this ideology, that it's actually a good or moral thing to have an ethno-state in a place where half the population isn't that ethnicity. So I mean, I think, but in theory, I think the Palestinian leadership has long since accepted, two states. I mean, that was sort of the whole premise of the Palestinian resistance and the first Intifada. East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and right over time. People have echoed the same talking points for an extraordinarily long period of time. I just think, 20 years after Oslo, the reality on the ground has shifted, and there are so many Israeli settlers, and the two populations are so integrated, that I think, that's I don't see that as viable. And I think the way Israelis react to that is basically by then pitching Palestinians some kind of a pseudo state, like the Trump plan, which again, Palestinians are never going to accept, or any group of people is going to accept, a state that is effectively a bunch of Bantustans. So yeah, I think in a two-state reality, we will, never be okay with the history, but I think there would be peace, and in in some kind of one state, one equal democratic state for everyone, I think people are more likely to accept the history, given that it would have ultimately worked out well, in the sense that, and people seem to have a misunderstanding of like the Palestinian identity, but we are from tribes that have lived in different places all over the lands. The physical structures, that were built by our forefathers, and the names of so many of the clans and so many of the tribes of Palestinians literally attributed to these particular locations. So the connection to the land is a big thing, and I think there's also a shift in Israeli political demographics where, secular Israeli Jews are not the predominant political force. And so the fact that traditional nationalists see a desire or, a connection to the lands in the West Bank and want to live there, given they feel that, this is the place that they have the most history in. I mean, that's an alternative approach to unify people. As if everybody loves the land, then why do you have this ideology of needing it to just be for your ethnic group? I think you have to pick one or the other. Either you have a demographic Jewish majority state, in which case you need to partition the country in half, and it needs to be a fair partition, or people won't accept it, because again, people have an innate sense of fairness. Or you need to have let go of the demographics concept, live anywhere in the land, and agree to equality. And that to me is, my personal view is Zionism, and that's a fairly loaded, term, a fairly long history. But ultimately, it has always struggled with this duality, and I feel like you have to pick one or the other. Either pick a chunk of the place that's a Jewish majority, where there isn't another population, or integrate with the people who are there and live equally side by side. There are so many groups who moved here, whether it's like the Armenians or people, Byzantines, or people who've lived in the land, moved here as a group at various eras in history, and they integrated with the local population. They're considered Palestinian today, and that's why we refer to Israelis as settler colonialists, because they didn't just move here to return to their homeland and integrate with the local population. They set up an ethnic state just for them. And regardless of whether you agree with that narrative or that history, ultimately today, you have to pick one or the other. I mean, it's inevitable. Either it's going to be one democratic equal state, or it needs to be two. You just can't be both democratic, majority Jewish, and then define your borders as a land that is half a different population. As for ideological Jewish hatred, I just don't think there is any. Marla, I think the hatred is towards the group of people that we see as our enemies. Those are the only interactions that we've had. I don't think there's any ideological. I think there's any ideological anti-Semitism. There is just a generic ethnic conflict, and so when Palestinians hate "quote unquote" Jews, they're referring to the group of people that they're at war with, they're in a conflict with. It's nothing to do with Jewish history or the Jewish religion or Jewish people as an ethnic group. If anything, every single one of those things would have been very compatible with the Palestinian culture and Palestinian identity. I mean, even after the Nakba and the Naksa, when Arafat wrote the PLO constitution, he referred to the Jews who were in Palestine prior to the first Aliyah as being Palestinian. I don't think there's any ideological reason that Palestinians would have against Jews. I think most of the ideological difference center around what we perceive Zionism to be, or what Zionism means to us. In my view, it's the ideologies that this duality that it has. You kind of have to pick one or the other. It's one thing for Herzl to say he wants to build a Jewish majority state. It's another when he wants to do it in a place that has another ethnic population. I mean, you kind of have to pick either connection to the land or connection to demographics, and depending on what matters more to you, I think that will define what solution you prefer, and what Israel's right to exist will mean in post-conflict.
Cool, thank you, Zahir. There's a few more good questions, but we are on the 2-hour mark, so we will just leave it for the after party. For those who want to continue the conversation, we're moving it over to Discord for the after party on the left-hand side. You will see the lounge. Once you enter, you'll see the lounge. Click it, you'll be connected. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, like. If you didn't like this video, give us a downvote. Just express yourself. Be real, be raw. We love you. There won't be a debate tomorrow. Taking a week off. Next Thursday, we have Inon Dan Kehati and John oh, fuck, I should have looked it up before pitching this. I always do that. Whatever, Inon and John next Thursday. It's going to be a good one. And then on February 8th, we have Noam Chomsky and Rudy Roshman. So that's going to be probably our biggest debate yet. Dani, Zahir, it was a great pleasure. And I know the crowd's going to, I know you'll be back soon with something. Maybe a Janine review, maybe another cool show. The fan favorites. See you all in Discord.